You're listening to the all-new KBLU-RADIO network. That's the Blue Raven Network. Visit our website at www.oneblueraven.weebly.com. Often duplicated, but never replicated. You're listening to the all-new KBLU-RADIO network. That's the Blue Raven Network.
Often duplicated, never replicated. You're listening to the all-new KBLU-RADIO network, Blue Raven Network.
The world of 1916 was complex, or the world of 1945 was complex. The world of 2016 is intensely complex. You'll be dealing with terrorists. You'll be dealing with hybrid armies. You'll be dealing with little green men. You're going to be dealing with tribes. You'll be dealing with national leaders and local leaders. You'll be dealing with politics and economics. You'll be dealing with direct fire and indirect fire. And you're going to be dealing with it all. And it's all going to be dealt with simultaneously.
December 7th, 2016. Scott Hensler, 1012 Hat Club. Hearts of Darkness. I'm going to really mostly be talking about Pearl Harbor. I want to bring some facts out, and I want to tie it into today. History has a way of repeating itself. I believe that 9/11 is a repeat of Pearl Harbor. And the information that I'm going to give tonight, maybe some of you have already heard it, maybe some of you are already on top of it, maybe it's new to some of you. But in either case, the so-called American government, the United States government, the United States corporation, is willing to sacrifice citizens that are Americans, that are Americans of the United States of America. And they've been doing it for over 100 years. And I really believe that, with Bush, when he got in office, Bush Jr., 9/11 happened shortly after that. I sort of see the same thing going to happen with Trump, and I know a lot of you don't like to hear that, but I'm sorry. What the play game has been, you bring in, a Democrat, then you bring in a Republican, you go to war. You bring in a Democrat, and you bring in a Republican, and you go to war. And somewhere in between, a lot of U.S. citizens lose their lives. And Pearl Harbor is a perfect example of that, along with 9/11. But before I get into that, I want to mention about the Oakland fire. I don't know if you're familiar with rave. It means basically going to an area where, kids that like to party, whether they're teenagers up through college years, a lot of bands, DJs, but the thing goes for a very long time, just a lot of craziness. And this particular warehouse in Oakland caught on fire, and the last count, I saw 24, 33, and now over 40. Just a tragic, terrible situation. Hearts go out to the families. I can't even imagine being trapped in a place that's on fire. And so it's just a very sad situation. And so the question is, what took place here? Now, when you look at the building, you look at the warehouse where this was at, a lot of occult symbols. But then a lot of the reports that I've seen, too, that a lot of threats have been made. And so we'll just have to see what happens. But either case, we just hate to see this. And whenever we see large fires where, they're in an entertainment hall, they're in a bar, they're in somewhere, and it catches on fire, it seems like a great deal of people are killed. And, if you've ever been in a fire, if you've ever been next to a house fire, the heat is incredible. I can remember I stopped one time for a house that was on fire, didn't know if there was someone in there, and I got out of my car, and I had to get back in my car. I don't know how people do it. The intense of the flames was amazing. When you see on TV where they're in a room and it's on fire and everything else, I'm sorry, that's just not the way that works. The 2,000 degrees, the 1,700 degrees, whatever that temperature is, that air becomes superheated, and just breathing it in immediately is a potential death, if not short-term, definitely on the long. So we'll just see what happens and pray that those that did get out, that they'll be okay, and that their spirits aren't damaged forever, because that's a terrible situation when you lose a friend and so forth. Now, I wanted to also mention that I'm, doing the shows myself now on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And so I'm reserving Tuesdays and Thursdays to do my call, to do my deliverances. I don't call it counseling. I'm spiritual warring for you, dealing with things on the phone for you, walk-ins. And I think that's the way that I'm going to run it now. It's just too much trying to do things while I do a show and get ready for the show anymore. So that's what I'm going to do. So Friday, I've asked a friend of mine, Rip Logan. Now, Rip and I, it's been about 2 years, maybe a little longer now. He gave me a call. I think it was back when the Whitestone Conference was going on there in Bozeman. When I had just, I was there, and dealing with, issues of, relationship that have to do with personality disorders, and did some counseling, working, praying, delivering, and have been doing it ever since. And now he's on his horse, and he's charging forth and now helping me. And so we're going to be doing a little bit of a coffee break. That's what I'm going to call it. We're just going to be going back and forth on this Friday at 5 p.m. Pacific time. And so I'm looking forward to that, because he's got a lot to bring to the table that he's experienced and what his breakthroughs. So, and of course, last Monday I did the Phoenix incident, the Phoenix lights. I'm going to be probably turning that into a YouTube. I've already finished it. It'll be a little more detailed than I normally do. I'm going to be having a lot of pictures that specifically point that out. But I also want to point out, too, that a lot of it is conjecture. A lot of it is some, information that, if you need to do your own research to verify some things. But, again, my whole premise or my whole point in that show was to get you to understand that things are not always as they appear. And that was certainly the case, and certainly the case with Pearl Harbor, which is going to be the main talk of tonight. And again, hearts of darkness. When I say hearts of darkness, I'm talking about those who are willing to allow innocent people perish in very large numbers. Just one person to allow them to perish, knowing that that will take place with the decisions, with the environment, with the circumstances, and you do nothing or actually perpetrate it, conspire. That's what a conspiracy is. To prior to the event, two or more, even one individual, premeditated to cause an act. And so either case, when you hear they try and knock down conspiracy theory, well, that terminology was coined by the very disinformation specialists that we stand against, because through controlling the words, manipulating them, holding the definition, them giving the perception of what something means, then they're able to control things. So in reality, Tinfoil Hat Club, it's how I, coined that, was to kind of, come back at those who are trying to come at the conspiracy theorists, saying that they are nuts, when in reality, as time has progressed, we see that these things are, conspiracy facts. Pearl Harbor would have been a conspiracy theory, but now we know it as a conspiracy fact. And so just the understanding of how they do this with the psyops, with social engineering, with causing you not to, to question yourself, is the whole game. So when things happen right in front of you, your cognitive dissonance isn't able to deal with it. And I can just imagine that as the people who were there at Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian Islands, as they saw the airplanes come in, I guess it was 1967 or so when I was, what was that, been 6th grade? I'm 60 now. There was a survivor who was actually there at Pearl Harbor that came in to talk to us, and he was mentioning that as the planes came in and they were dropping the bombs, there was a lot of people at first thought it was a gag. It was kind of a joke to fly a plane over and drop something onto somebody, I guess out of boredom, and a lot of people thought that's what it was, and of course when the ordinances started to go off, then it's a different story. So from December 7th, 1941 to here we are, December 7th, 2016, we're talking about 75 years of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, there was an estimated 2,400 that lost their lives, 21 ships that were sunk or completely destroyed. 188 aircraft was destroyed. And this was from the Japanese Imperial Navy, also employing the Japanese Imperial Air Force. At that time, aircraft carriers, the technology of death from above was increasing. Prior to that, battleships were battleships. They were to stand against each other and basically pound on each other. And then with the technology of, the advancements of the planes and their ability to manipulate and control and their payloads for more armament, more bombs, that aircraft became one of the main tools. Now, our own Navy, though it had, aircraft carriers and so forth, the Japanese were very astute. They had their own technology that they were advancing forward. They actually, if they were to have continued even without opposition in time, they would have been a problem. But what I want to bring out here is that our government was very aware of this and actually instigated the Pearl Harbor attack, and with it, again, 2,400. Now, this includes women as well that would have been on the base. But just think of this, them knowing, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Pentagon, those in charge knew exactly what they were doing and allowed this to happen and actually instigated it. So but it should have been held on treason. They should have been held for the murder of these citizens. This should have been a time for us to wake up and understand that the government is not here to help us. You ever heard the story, there's a knock at the door and you open up and they say, "Hi, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you"? Well, they're lying. How do you know that? Their lips are moving. There's nothing here to contribute to the citizens of America. Now, we need to understand at this time that the Japanese had already come into agreement with Hitler, had already come into agreement with Italy. They had already made their pacts, they had already made their treaties, they were allies. And so we know how, Hitler, how this all started out. Now, there's a lot of things about Germany, a lot of things about Hitler that have to do with Albert Pike, have to do with the Illuminati, with the instigation. And I believe that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, along with the other Roosevelts that were in there, and he was one that was of the Masonics. I believe, too, that he was of the New World Order. And so, again, following the morals and dogma, this was the mainstay or main step into bringing us into World War II. And again, using U.S. citizens and U.S. naval, U.S. Personnel to be slaughtered to cause a anger within the American people that they would join the war, because this is exactly what they wanted. Okay? Now, U.S. claimed that this was a unprovoked attack, calling it war. This is what Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself said, and Congress giving him the green light to move forward, being backed by U.S. citizens. And it's understandable to not know the true story, what was going on. I'd be infuriated too. We were infuriated with 9/11, remember? I mean, we were in such shock, and this was the same situation. Again, history repeats itself. But in reality, this all started years earlier with embargoes, sanctions, blockades, broken treaties. We need to remember that all the materials that the Japanese needed, they didn't have as raw materials on their island. Very overpopulated, a small island. They didn't have the materials that we had. You know, we were able to get rubber from, Africa, copper, from the States, tin, oil, steel, scrap iron, medical supplies, food, different things to sustain. Now, the Japanese were, as I was mentioning, increasing. They were actually becoming a very industrial nation. They were also going to become a military complex. They already had an army that was very strong, which had already invaded China, by the way, and they wanted to improve their navy, and this way they could go to other locations to get their materials. I mean, think about it. So the materials that they were allowed in the very beginning that came from the United States and came from other countries, they used immediately to build up their navy. So they had a formidable navy that was very powerful, and their goal was to be the most dominant on the Pacific and eventually working towards the Atlantic. And again, we need to remember that they were in cahoots with Germany. So at this point in time, then Franklin Delano Roosevelt started bringing sanctions against them. He even seized their bank accounts, different stocks, bonds, holdings within the United States. Now, we need to understand that any time that one nation does this to another nation, that in reality that's actually an act of war. When treaties are broke like this, it puts the population of the country's citizens at risk. When the economy is at risk, where individuals then could, lose, their supplies for food to sustain, it puts a nation in distress, especially when you take their oil away. And so again, that in itself was an act of war. Now at the same time, the understanding of what the Japanese were doing and with their invasion of China already, I can understand this, but again, the way that this was handled, the way that this was approached, had allowed the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor and, again, the killing of our own people. So as the Japanese expanded, as they continued forth, and then all of a sudden the axe dropped and they were cut off, they were desperate. So in reality, Franklin Delano Roosevelt put them up against a wall. And knowing full well that in time that they were going to have to do something. If they were going to sustain themselves, even to maintain what they already had, not just in growth, but just to maintain what they had to take action. So their, the statistics, the military abilities to understand your enemy, they knew this was all going to happen. All right? Now, with a domination pending, for Asia of the Japanese, again already fighting and taking some strongholds on China, this also brought a threat to Korea. There was also an issue with Taiwan, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I spent 90 days there, so I've got some idea of what took place. The Philippines. I mean, basically all hell was ready to break loose. And us as the United States stood in the way of the Japanese, okay? Now, this isn't talked about very much. So as I talk about Taiwan and I talk about China, the Japanese Now, they became very ruthless during World War II, the Bataan Death March. There was a lot of programming, a lot of social engineering on the people for them to think that we were going to behead them, we were going to eat them, we were going to do all these terrible things. And so it's one of the reasons that they fought so hard when they were on the islands and we were trying to take them back, because they believed that if this was to take place, that their souls would wander aimlessly in the spirit and never find home with their ancestors. It doesn't sound much to us, but to them that was their religion. That's the way they thought, and so it terrified them. So again, this was also part of a social engineering from the Emperor of Japan, and with them lying to the people, because it was a lie, again backing them and programming them to fight even harder. All right? But what they were also known, the Japanese, is that they would take women from China and use them as sex slaves. So they were sex slavery, human trafficking was already being done by the Japanese, and the Chinese were the victims of this. At the time, the Chinese, even though they've had their armies, they've had their day, they were still very vulnerable because, one, they're a high population. You could come into a certain area and get a high amount of people in a very short period of time and then leave. And so the Chinese were vulnerable, and the Japanese took that to every step that they could. Now, later on, as we talk about today, now that the Chinese are where they're at, they're no one to be messed with. They have their own army. They have a 200 million man army. They have nuclear weapons. They have all the technologies, thank you, Bill Clinton, that we do, and so they're no one to be messed with. And the Chinese demanded from the Japanese recently, in the past 5 years, or since Fukushima, that they wanted an apology for the taking of Chinese women, turning them into sex slaves for the Japanese military. And basically, the Japanese gave them the finger. And the Chinese, you can imagine, were not very happy about this. And within a very short period of time, a corona, generally generated by HAARP when it comes to weather in or earthquake, was seen over the epicenter that took place in the ocean that caused the tidal wave to hit Fukushima. Sounds a little suspicious, doesn't it? So I tell you what, when you go looking for trouble, you're going to find it. If you're not willing to work with people and there's somebody who's, it's just like you don't want to make the cook mad, or who knows what you're going to eat. And that turned out to be the situation. Now, I do want to mention that when I was in Taiwan, that when the Japanese took that over and they were running it, they were pretty brutal. And beheading was very big, just as it was in Bataan. And the same thing with beheading, that if they were to lose their head, the Asians believe this, then they, being separated from their body, in a beheading, that their souls would wander aimlessly. So this was a very horrific thing to do to somebody, and there were stations all over the Taiwan island where the Japanese were doing this, as well as basically raping the women. Now, when the Japanese finally surrendered and on the withdrawal off of that island, the Taiwan island being off of China there, did not have any venomous snakes. And the Japanese, on their way out, released venomous snakes. So on the north end of the island is where most of them are at. They still have the snakes, and to this day, people are still dying, working the fields, the rice fields, when they're trying to do, just do their daily chores. They run into these snakes and they get bit and they die. So this is a curse. The land was cursed. And again, whenever you do such horrific things, people pay for a very long time. And so this is just a really bad situation. When I was in Taiwan, basically they're Chinese. Basically they are Aborigines and Chinese. The island was taken over. It was an Aborigines island, and they were taken over by the Chinese a long time ago and commingled, and now you have the Taiwanese. So they're Aborigines Chinese. And then you have a lot of just purebred Chinese and a lot of purebred Aborigines. But in either case, I found them to be wonderful people. I really enjoyed it there. And, of course, they're Chinese, and so they speak Mandarin. Aborigines or Taiwanese is not used because it does not have a counting system. And so in order to do commerce, you have to run numbers, right? And so that is why the adaptation of Mandarin has been done. So anyways, remember too that the Japanese during this time for World War II has made agreement with Hitler, and so that's a very bad combination. Now, with Roosevelt basically halting all the materials and freezing all the assets, again, as I mentioned, in itself, that is a declaration of war. So in reality, the Japanese, in all rights, did what they did to Pearl Harbor. Now, I'm not condoning that whatsoever. The Japanese actually tried to make amends. They tried to make peace. They tried to bring the treaties in. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt literally dropped everything. He dropped communication. He did everything. When you're looking for a fight, he did everything possible. When you go looking for trouble, you're going to find it. He did it. And that was, again, getting the Japanese to a point where they had no choice. All right? So they were up against a wall. And in their negotiation, everything failed. And so the last thing was then for their Navy to go out, 2 islands that were even under U.S. rule or an agreement of trade, and start taking materials. So they were already being a problem. All right? So this just didn't just come out of nowhere and all of a sudden Pearl Harbor was attacked. So now we need to understand that the British and the Dutch, we were allies with, though we had not entered into the war. We were in free trade agreements, that they too withdrew from the Japanese. So the British and the Dutch pulling away their supplies, again, put the Japanese in a very bad situation. Now, however Pearl Harbor was managed and the management there on the naval, most of them were in absolute blackout of any of this that was going on. Now, they knew there were sanctions, but they did not have the information that was coming from the Pentagon, coming from Washington, coming from the basic command posts that would have, given them the information necessary to understand that Japan was really going to be attacking Pearl Harbor, okay? So in that, in itself, regardless of the intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, the Naval Command, the President himself, even Congress, they knew all this. And yet the commanders, those that were there at Pearl Harbor, had no idea that this was starting to happen, okay? Now, this strategic implementation of this early attack actually started as early as July 1941. Now, at that time, radio communications were pretty advanced. The Japanese had it as well. And so with the encryption, being able to decode in our decoders, we were able to decode a lot of radio transmissions. We already knew the fleets were out there. But here's one thing that's not talked about a lot. The transcontinental telephone lines that were laid between Europe and then those over to Asia. So there were phone lines in the oceans, and those phone lines, by the way, were tapped. All right? Our intelligence agencies, the FBI, even though there were federal laws against it, they were all tapped. They even had specific phones that were linked into San Francisco and those areas where they knew there was a lot of Japanese population, and they were able to decode, they were able to tap and decipher the communications that was coming out of the United States, coming out of Pearl Harbor, of their strategic plan, all the information, how many ships were there, where they were located, everything that the Japanese needed to finally tune the attack the United States was monitoring. They knew this, all right? And here's one thing that isn't talked about a lot. J. Edgar Hoover, okay, the pervert himself, the FBI director, the one who actually founded the FBI, with his wiretaps, he too knew about Pearl Harbor. He knew about the attacks. Do you understand what I just said? And so we look at the FBI today to think that they're our friends. We look at the Department of Homeland Security. We look at the Pentagon. We look at the CIA. Look, this stuff's been going on for a very, very long time. So no information was given to the commanders of Pearl Harbor. Now, the specific commander at the time who just took over was a 4-star Rear Admiral Commander Kimmel. Okay? He was completely kept in the dark. Now, of course, he had some idea that with sanctions there could possibly be, but they thought if there was going to be anything, there would be some, skirmishes that would take place on other islands just because of the raw materials to take them, but they had no idea that, in fact, that there was going to be a full-fledged attack. All right? Now, Kimmel himself, along with General Short, were the scapegoats during this, by the way. They were staged up to take the blame off the Pentagon, off of Washington, D.C., off of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But Kimmel himself, along with General Short, in 1991, even though all the presidents prior were giving all the information to exonerate them, the Senate finally did this after the information that they looked at, and brought them back to a status because they were actually court-martialed, or not court-martialed, but they were actually lowered in their statuses, which, and again, at that particular time, and when you were someone of that rank and you were demoted, you might as well just be court-martialed. You can imagine how hard that was to take that, especially when there really wasn't much they could do. In fact, there's information that if they actually did know that if our ships had gone out to them and met them, because of the air superiority that they had, and remember, we were in the mainframe mind of battleships, 2 drunk guys slugging it out, instead of using the upgraded technology that planes offered. So in a sense, it would have turned out probably bad either way. But the point of it is that none of the information was given for them to even make that decision, all right? So Roosevelt wanted this to happen, okay? Now, you need to understand, all of these guys in the presidency are all related together. Somewhere there's a bloodline that has to do with the black nobility, has to do with the Illuminati, has to do with the reptilian demon seed, okay? They're all the Masonic, all of them, every one of them. So the New World Order, again, with Albert Pike and Morals and Dogma, this was the perfect plan to bring Japanese into Pearl Harbor to bomb them, to get the United States to back the war. All right? Now, with the communications that were blocked off, the communications that were brought in, that those who were, let's say, willing to go ahead and take orders, there was a new radar installation that was placed at Pearl Harbor. It was completely shut down. It was of state-of-the-art. It had long range. It had the ability to identify, not just that there was something there, but it had sensitivity that gave you the capability of telling you the size of the plane and how many were out there, not just that there was something out there. It was shut down. It was turned off. Now, here's where there's a Montauk connection. Okay, I did Montauk a couple of weeks ago. And I mentioned about the 2 men that testified that they were the ones who basically went overboard and went into the dimensions, ended up there at Montauk, the Philadelphia experiment. So these 2 gentlemen were actually stationed at Pearl Harbor. Now, with their physics and their psychic abilities already working with mind control and so forth, these men, 48 hours prior to the attack, were taken off the island. They were taken off the island and brought into the Philadelphia experiment. Later on, it was stated that they were too valuable to lose. So they were taken out, they were given new orders, and went to the Philadelphia experiment to go on to dealing with the ship that disappeared, how it reappeared. I talked about Montauk itself, how that went out of control. There was a phase lock that took place between the 2 times, and these were the 2 gentlemen They were actually there at Pearl Harbor and removed. Now, this is their testimony with the information, and that's about as much as I know of it, but it sounds like that it has facts to it, all right? Well, again, we need to understand with Roosevelt and his Masonic homeboys, they got their wish. Now, when the Japanese came in, they came in with an incredible strike of not just the air, not just of sea, but they also came in with small subs, actually came into the bay, came into the naval port where the ships were anchored, okay? And so the small submarines that they had, they were actually able to deploy torpedoes into the ships as well as the planes that were able to drop bombs, ordnances, even other types of torpedoes. It was a bloodbath. You can imagine, just, in a twinkling of an eye, everything, all hell breaks loose. And again, since they were in subs inside, now, it was thought for a long time that they weren't, but one of the detective programs, somebody had brought them a photograph that had been taken from an aerial reconnaissance during the attack, and as they researched the picture, they came to the realization that they actually had the photography, a picture taken of the submarine that released the torpedo that hit the Arizona and hit the other ships that were there, and there was a rooster tail that was coming off of the submarine and the torpedo as it was being deployed, the one that actually hit the magazine. So it was a history-making photograph that they were finally able to decipher through this program when they brought it to them. History detectives, I believe they call it. And then they later found the sub when they were trolling the area as it was trying to make its escape out. Now, a lot of these missions were death missions. We know about the kamikazes. We know that was a one-way trip. But what you may not have known is that there are actually torpedoes that were designed to have a one man in it because they didn't have the technology to avoid porpoising. They would send a torpedo out and it would veer, and so their percentages of strikes were pretty low. Where we had that ability, we had that technology. They didn't. So they actually had men that would get in these torpedoes like a kamikaze, a one-way trip. Same thing with the submarines. These submarines were basically, if they could have got out of it, they could have, but with the oxygen that was in there and as small as it was a one-way trip. And so this was a preemptive strike. This was to do as much damage as possible to eliminate the U.S. Navy from Pearl Harbor, and in that, by striking them out, then the U.S. Navy could continue their pillaging of the other islands and other countries that would have been normally stopped so they could get their raw materials that we were denying them from having. All right? So again, remember, as that took place, that there were 2,400, including civilians, children and women, that were murdered. And then it is what it is. I don't care whether you call it an act of war. Again, whenever there's another way out of it, and when you have the heads of state, that's murder. I'm sorry. So many people died under the basic philosophy of the Illuminati, of the Masonic, that they're willing to sacrifice the lives of the innocent in order to implement their greed. That's really what it amounts to. Now, another thing that I don't know how many are familiar with it. Now, the military in itself, with their tires, had a better grade rubber, but most civilians still had natural rubber tires. And so there were a lot of people that were seeking protection underneath the vehicles. You can imagine, I mentioned about the fire for the rave there in Oakland, how hot things get. And just to get away from the fire itself, you do whatever it takes. And so there were people who were seeking refuge underneath the cars. But these cars, the civilian cars, had natural rubber tires, and they could not sustain the temperature, and they were bursting. And, of course, when the tires would burst, the tires then would come down on the people who were hiding underneath them. So there were a lot of people who lost their lives underneath the cars. I mean, it's just beyond comprehension. As I get in towards 9/11 here, again, the horrid visual that takes place in something like this is just amazing. All right, so again, just all mayhem, chaos, insanity. All right. Again, the very fact that this could have been avoided, I mean, there's always a way out. There's always something that can be done. Now, of course, with the Japanese army wanting to, be who they were, we may still have engaged, but again, the very fact of, just like 9/11, setting up, thousands of people to perish just to get us into a war, that's not how you do things. That shows you the hearts of darkness. That shows you the depravity. That shows you the depths of Satan. That shows you that people are willing to allow other people to suffer and perish for their own gain, and that is narcissists. They're, basically, they're psychopaths. There's no other way to look at this, all right? Now, one of the most famous ships that is still there, by the way, in Pearl Harbor is the USS Arizona, BB-39. That was a battleship. It was named after Arizona in commemoration of the 48th state. Now, that ship alone, in its time, in its prime, was $16 million to make, all right? So if you add up all the other ships that were there at the time for the money, I mean, that's a tremendous amount of value of taxpayers' money that also was thrown away. I mean, no one ever talks about that. I mean, the life is one thing, but then the willingness to sacrifice all of that money, in an attempt to gain something for your own. Now, the USS Arizona, when I was doing the research, I just brought tears to my eyes. 1,177 officers and crewmen were on that ship. The torpedoes that came from the subs I was talking about, plus the planes that were able to drop them, managed to hit the magazine. So all the ordnances, all the bombs, everything that was on there went off. And this is one of the reasons there was such a high casualty. So that particular ship was damaged so badly. The ships that were sunk, they were able to be raised again. But this one was so bad, understanding breaking basically into three pieces, that it was not recoverable. And as you know, if you've been to Hawaii, you'll know that the USS Arizona is now a memorial. It's a memorial for all the 2,400 that perished during that time. And many of the bodies are still in that ship. Now, just like the sub that was found, that when they finally got in and looked in it, of course, the men that were in there have been, over the years, dissolved away. So I assume, too, that with this is the same. But I just, I never had a chance to go there. I would love to go there. I understand there's still oil dripping out of there, some, a little bit seeping, which is amazing. But in itself, the spiritual aspect, can you imagine? All of those men, all the spirits that were released, good and bad, the horrific situation. Whenever you spill blood, and whenever it's under an occult act, which it was, there's a stronghold that takes place. So again, when I went to Wounded Knee, when I drove past there for the first time, the anxieties, the sorrow that I could feel was absolutely terrible. So I can just imagine. So again, was this unprovoked by the Japanese? No, it wasn't. Could it have been avoided? Yes, absolutely, it could have been avoided. Did the U.S. government, president, intend to do this? Absolutely, absolutely. And again, Germany was next. The Lusitania, if you're familiar with Lusitania, it actually left port in New York. The intelligence agencies allowed information to be leaked to the German intelligence agencies, with the fact that even though this was a civilian carrier, that on board was military armament And so the wolf pack, known as the submarines, the United States government knew full well with that information that was leaked that they were going to take the ship down. This was a British ship, but it left New York. And so this is what brought us into the German War. So again, we have Pearl Harbor, we have Lusitania. Again, the acts of our so-called government that is supposed to take care of us, to protect us against our enemies, is actually the enemy ourselves. Now, just jumping to the Korean War, the Korean War in itself was never really declared war. It was a police action. But please remember that at least 55,000 Americans died. Now, Vietnam in itself, with 58,000, which I think is probably a small number, that the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the Maddox, the USS Maddox, August 4th, 1964, there were 4 killed, but this whole thing was staged by Lyndon Johnson. It's reported that he was on the phone communication to the Pentagon, basically, or those commanders, saying that he wanted that GD ship down at the bottom. He wanted to bring us into the Vietnam War. So again, this whole thing was staged, and he was willing to have every man on that ship killed. And there were 4 killed, there were several injured, but the fighting of the men, their ability to maneuver and tactically stand, saved their life. Otherwise, that ship would have gone down. That brought us into the Vietnam War. And again, it just shows that the U.S. government's willing to do whatever it takes. Now, the Civil War, think about that. There were 620,000. Again, World War II, 418,000 supposedly Americans, but in total, the number I came up with was about 64 or about 84 million. There's numbers now of 100 million, 110 million people during that war. I mean, that's just amazing, the loss of life. The Iraq War, 4.5 thousand. Afghanistan, 1.8 thousand, with $6 trillion being spent for the Iraq-Afghan. Okay, now remember Desert Shield? Bush Sr., the New World Order guy, right? 1990, 1991, Desert Shield turned into Desert Storm. There was 147 deaths in this. Okay, now we learned exactly what they were really doing. The whole thing staged just like 9/11, because as we get into 9/11, this was to pull us into another war that is still continuing. Again, as I talked about Iraq and Afghanistan, that it's the ability to sacrifice U.S. people. 9/11, Bush Jr. himself, Steve Cheney, the Twin Towers, Building 7, almost 3,000 people. And by the way, 2,700 have died since from cancer from the toxic materials. So literally, and I believe that's a low number. So literally as many died that day or have died from the toxic exposure to the materials that, and you need to remember, they knew all this. They knew there were long-term effects. So in reality, let's just round it out to about 5,000 people. And remember, these are U.S. citizens. Now, the Bushes are friends with the Saudis. The Saudi family was in New York, and they were escorted out 24 hours just prior to 9/11. All right? And Cheney told NORAD to stand down. Now, you need to remember, with our defense system, there's no way that these planes were capable of getting to that point. The F-15s, F-16s just would have taken them out. But Steve Cheney, again, he's, a Blackwater. He's of that whole thing. He's another one of these Illuminati New World Orderists. He intervened, and so the blood of the American people are on his hand every bit as the Bushes. So remember, this is all from the hands of the same Masonic, dark-hearted reptilians. And the question is, what happens next? We've got these FEMA camps, we've got chemtrails, cyclotronics, vaccinations, not to mention the abortion, Roe versus Wade, 59 million plus U.S. citizens, that's what they are. I don't care if they're in the womb or not. The Constitution protects them. They were murdered in the womb. So again, the casualties of war continue. Again and again and again. History repeats itself. So again, what's next? Just like Bush taking office and 9/11 happened right after it, with Trump taking office, are we going to have another 9/11? Now, when I say this, we look at the fact, Democrat comes in, few skirmishes, Republican comes in, we go to war. Democrat comes in, a few skirmishes, Republican comes in, we go to war. So now that history's been repeating itself, then I have to say that through probability, through running the numbers statistically, it looks very, very, very possible with Trump coming in that very soon we're going to be into something. Nuclear, biological, who knows? Now, I'd like to mention, too, that since I'm up in the Northwest here, I'm not too far from Hanford, Washington. There was an intent of release of radioactivity, late 40s, early 50s, I forget. That was intent. Now, Hanford is where the nuclear bombs were processed. When you put the waste together and you've actually got to formulate it to make it what it is, that took place at Hanford. That's along the Columbia River, of all places to put something like that, contaminating the water. So it's basically West Washington, Hanford. They intentionally released a nuclear cloud just to see how it would affect the citizens in that area. And through the winds that came through, some of it actually made its way up to Spokane, which is just to my west here, about 20 minutes away. Now, it was brought to reality to me of what they did because I actually ministered to somebody that their grandmother actually died from the effects of that radiation in Spokane. So again, U.S. citizens being guinea pigs, being placed into a situation without say that their lives mean nothing to those who consider themselves the elite, all right? Now, Hanford in itself is a time bomb. There's chemical reactions that are taking place. They've got storage places, facilities on the ground where they came along in the 70s and they thought they were going to change and dilute it, and what in reality they made it worse, and so it's just percolating. Now, let's just say that someone does come along, whether it's a suitcase bomb or whether it's a, continental ballistic missile. If it hits that particular area, this whole northwest area is gone. The amount of radiation that will be released is never going to allow us to have it back. Everything that we know dearly and admire for the beauty and the love of this place will be completely gone. Okay? So again, this great government of ours has been killing us for over 100 years. And the question is, why are they going to stop? What would make them stop? And I know you want to believe in Trump, but again, when I run the numbers and when I know that history repeats itself, I can't help think that what Obama has placed with the executive orders, with FEMA, with the Department of Homeland Security, which was staged, from the Bushes, that everything's been in place and everything's ready. Now, again, I don't like bringing this information, but I'm not going to not talk about it. I'm not going to do a blackout like they did with the Admiral there in Hawaii. If I know what's going on and I have an inkling of what's going on, I'm going to tell you. That's what I do. Same thing with, dealing with deliverance. If you come in and you've got a curse on you, if you've got a certain particular order of demons, I'm going to address the legal rights that those demons have and why they're there. If I do not do that, then I'm doing you a disservice because it means you're not going to be delivered, you're not going to be set free, you're not going to be healed. The curses are going to continue. You may have premature death, early death. You may have spirits of suicide. You may have infirmities. There may be a time bomb of a particular demon that will enact cancer. You may have something that is going to enact at a certain time. I've had people that when their demons manifest, and through the interrogation, I waterboard them, I interrogate them, I find out that sometimes there are demons that are dormant. Part of the curse is to bring insanity at age 50. The curse is to bring cancer at age 45. The curse is to get them into bad relationships that they will continue divorce. And, of course, that breaks your heart, that fractures your soul, and so you live in absolute torment. Now, we take into the equation of all the men and women that have dealt with all these wars, and we add in the factor of post-traumatic stress. Now, one of the things that Julie and I talked about when we first met, her being in the Gulf War or being in that situation, that she actually dealt with spirits, with demons that were actually manifesting on the fronts in war situations. She dealt with soldiers that actually in themselves became demonized through the combat. Otherwise, there's a point in time when you defend yourself, and there's a point in time when you don't pull the trigger because you don't need to, and there's a point in time when you go too far and you're actually committing crimes, war crimes, and you're committing murder. Now, this takes place all the time, and when that takes place, it's murder. Okay? Now, they tried to rewrite Scripture in saying, thou shalt not kill. No, it says, thou shalt not murder. When you need to defend yourself and you need to defend your family and your country, you do what it takes to do that. But to actually murder means to take the life of somebody who's innocent. And so the situations that our troops have been placed in, especially in Vietnam, that was a terrible situation, that there's crimes that take place, and in that crime you can become demonized. Now, along with this comes post-traumatic stress. The guilt, the shame, the toxic shame that you've done something, whether it was a child, whether it was a woman, whether it was another soldier, whatever the circumstances are, even just defending yourself, being placed into that, where bombs go off, you have high impact, you have trauma base that is very traumatic, fractures, splits your soul. Same thing with trauma-based mind control, those things of satanic ritual abuse. So in reality, when we look at war, when we see what took place in Pearl Harbor, when we see what took place in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, Iraq, Afghanistan, even those things of Desert Storm, all the way through, every one of them leaves devastation. Every one of them leaves a curse. Every one of them leaves something behind that continues to rear its ugly head and to basically put people in poverty, put them into insanity, commit suicide. I mean, look at our troops here now. We're dealing with up to 25 a day who are committing suicide. This was all by design, ladies and gentlemen, from Pearl Harbor to 9/11 to what we're dealing with today. It was all by design. This is the New World Order. This is the Illuminati. This is how they implement the spilling of blood, the sacrifices, to enable demons to have legal right, to open up the portals. Now we look at CERN. Again, I connected that with the Philadelphia experiment, time travel, the ability to, the Mandela effect to change things. This is a time that, as I mentioned before, that if you are continuing in your sin, if you are one who wants to do it your own way, well, you're going to find out that there is only one way, and that is Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus paid for all past, present, and future sins. And so in that recognition, we can be set free. But we also have to understand that what we've done is wrong, as I did. That's how I came into the deliverance ministry. Look, I was a stinker. I was a womanizer. I drank, did drugs. I was a problem. I was a menace to society. And there was a point in time when I was able, the Holy Spirit allowed me to take a look at myself. And what I saw was very ugly. And it was horrible. I did not like myself. And so there was a change in my heart. There was an understanding that there needs to be an elimination of the old man to be able to move forward under the divine grace of God. And by doing so, that in His protection and His divine wisdom and guidance, that I'm able to do what I do for others. And so as I bring all this together, I just want you to simply understand that you too have been called. If you're an atheist, if you're a witch, if you're a narcissist that is able to come to the understanding of what you've done is wrong, then you will be delivered. you will be set free. But if you're going to continue with a heart of darkness, that you will be rejected, because God has provided a way out for all of us. And that way out is Jesus Christ. And through any other means, it's not going to work. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for serving. You were used, but you came, you gave, and you did your job. God bless you for that. And if you need help, give me a call. Again, Tuesdays and Thursdays. All right, and I'll be back on Friday. I'm going to have Rip Logan. All right.
You're listening to the all-new KBLU Radio Network. That's the Blue Raven Network. Visit our website at www.oneblueraven.weebly.com. Often duplicated, but never replicated. You're listening to the all-new KBLU-RADIO Network. That's the Blue Raven Network.
Often duplicated, never replicated. You're listening to the all-new KBLU Radio Network, Blue Raven Network.